Hello, this is the African teacher, Maurice Odhiambo, right here in Nairobi, Kenya. Very, very soon, the government of Kenya will start telling its citizens, most of them very ignorant of what goes on in the country, that Kenya will have less fertilizer or not sufficient fertilizer because of the war of aggression against Iran by the United States of America and Israel. That news is coming. In fact, I am just reading a newspaper story titled How a Protracted Iran Conflict Will Affect You. This is in the Daily Nation of Friday, March 27th, 2026. And so the stories have started. Now, what the government of Kenya will not tell Kenyans is a scandal that happened in the 1970s, and that is actually responsible for Kenya's problems with fertilizer. That is the Kenren Company scandal. Now, let me read to you what the Nairobi Law Monthly reported in January 2014 when it was reviewing the Kenren fertilizer scandal. Exactly 39 years ago this month, that is January 2014, 13 individuals assembled in Finance Minister Mwai Kibaki's waiting room at 2:30 p.m. Among them were 3 whites who had just arrived from Belgium. W.M. Muguro was the chair of the assembly. He sat next to C.S. Mbindio and J.G. Shamalwa, both from Kibaki's office. The 3 whites had just arrived from Brussels, Belgium. They were M.A. Train, J. Laverie, and Dr. Harper Johnson. Muguro welcomed them and explained his government's decision to set up a fertilizer factory to cover for the shortfall in supply of this key farming commodity. He outlined requisite data to emphasize his point that Kenya is in serious demand of a fertilizer manufacturing plant. He then invited them to respond. This is what then the Nairobi Law Monthly concluded about that specific meeting. And from that moment, and by that gesture, a monumental scandal was born. This disgrace will have held Kenya at ransom for 40 years next June. In other words, 40 years in June 2014. That was now 40 years of that scandal raging and Kenyans paying for nothing. Let me repeat again. This disgrace will have held Kenya at ransom for 40 years next June when the government makes the last payment to the European financiers seeking compensation for the failed project. That apart, by that time, the taxpayer will have coughed over 10 billion on hot air, so to speak. The Kenren idea itself was meant to cost about 100 million Kenya shillings in 1975. So not only did Kenyans fail to realize a project that could have helped the country for the last, we are now talking about almost 60 years, Kenya could have also been in a position to be a net exporter of fertilizer in the region. I want to tell you what corruption really does to this country. Because when you are told that the Iran war is responsible for unavailability of fertilizer, you will not be told that the only reason Kenya does not have its own fertilizer, the only reason Kenya cannot supply fertilizer to the region is because of the Kenren scandal that was engineered during the presidency of Jomo Kenyatta, and Mwai Kibaki, who later became the president of Kenya, was actually the finance minister. Now you know, because this system of corruption started way back from colonial times. It was inherited by the blacks who inherited power at that point, particularly from the 60s, the Kikuyu elites who inherited power. You can see that Mwai Kibaki was in the finance docket in the 70s, and he was the president of Kenya just about 15, 20 years ago. So the rings of corruption ran the Kenyan state. And before that changes, we cannot benefit from our resources. If we were now dealing with the African continent, for example, through a Pan-Africanist philosophy, we would now have Nigeria, Dangote, supplying oil. We would have Kenya supplying fertilizer. We would not still be relying on the Gulf, on the Arab states who are being attacked because they are part and parcel of the United States empire. They are being attacked for hosting military bases over there. So when this story comes, remember the Kenren scandal.